one of the big things that we can all do if we own a house is insulation. And you can put it on the inside, not a good idea, but that means putting it on the outside. And is there a way that the planning authorities are going to stop people who especially live in conservation areas from installing outside insulation?
Who's going to be the brave soul? There is climate change embedded in planning. I think Georgina will be able to answer that. And you're absolutely right, insulation in the home is one of the key measures. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I recently discovered a website called EcoFurb where you can enter your own postcode, and it takes into account your location, and it acknowledges if you're in a conservation area, and it gives some tips based on your most recent EPC rating. I think that's quite a good tool. One of the things we're launching very soon, hopefully in the next couple of days, certainly in the next week or two, is a residents action pack, which has all sorts of actions that residents can take. So at home is one of them. It doesn't obviously go into the level of detail for individual residents and individual homes, but it signposts people to helpful information sources like that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, as Jason says, individual planning rules apply, and it is quite complicated in Richmond. Richmond has particularly complicated housing stock in that sense. Which is why I'd definitely encourage you to have a look at EcoFurb. I think it's a really good, helpful resource. Those sorts of things.
Could I just add to that of course, as well as insulation, we also have to think about alternative ways of heating our houses, and probably the most appropriate way for the future will be by air pump exchange mechanisms. Now that I, like probably 90% of the audience here, live in an Edwardian or Victorian house in Kew. And that's an exceedingly difficult thing to do at the moment, because you need larger radiators than you would have at the moment. You need underfloor heating and so on, all very difficult in a conversion job in an Edwardian house. But I think there's some interesting news there from the energy company Octopus. They claim, I haven't seen any hard evidence, but they claim to have developed air exchange heat pumps which are able to heat water to the same level as we would do with our domestic boilers. And if that is the case, then of course we should be able to do a straight swap for a boiler for our present plumbing systems. But I believe there are grounds for optimism.
Any further questions? I think Carol's just reminded me that any new builds would obviously have to be compliant with certain regulations. Myself, having retrofitted my house, I lost about 6 inches internally from inside, but we reaped the benefits because of the savings on costs. Sorry, there was another question.
Are we missing the point about the aeroplanes? Isn't the pollution far worse from aeroplanes than anything else you've been talking about?
Carol, do you want to answer that one, or Professor?
At the moment, in terms of CO2, the aeroplanes only contribute about 1 to 2% of the world total. But as other people improve, unless other ways can be found to fly aeroplanes, apart from the sort of fuels they use now, as other people decrease their contribution of CO2, the aeroplane contribution will rise proportionately.
That's true for NO2 as well. At the moment, the contribution is relatively low because the planes overflying us, they're about 1,400 foot down to 1,200 from Kew to Richmond. So the boundary layer, which is about 1,000 foot up, does stop a lot of the NO2 coming down for years. It will come down eventually. But at the moment, we monitor at the roadside. We don't have the ability to monitor up where the planes are. And for the people breathing on the earth, then the contribution at the moment is not that significant. But as we improve, as we reduce our emissions, then unless the aircraft do the same, they will become relatively higher.
So I think the answer to that is there's lots of action to tackle roadborne air pollution. We're seeing the results of that over time. As that reduces, the contribution from aircraft will increase. So it's still there, it's still an issue. But at the moment, our main causes are domestic heating and road transport. Next question.
Is this working? John Coates worked with you for many, many years. Is he still around? That's the first question.
He retired at Christmas.
Sorry?
He retired at Christmas. I worked with John Coates for many, many years. Before Jason came around, John was, but he was doing the aircraft noise until he retired at Christmas.
He was excellent. And he, with myself, asked a question in the House, in the House of Parliament. Is there anything alive behind an aircraft while the engine is running, whether it's in the sky or on the ground? And where we have that little pink patch on an earlier map, we know we have an awful lot of aeroplanes bumbling along. We can hear them from here, even if they're standing still. I do think that London is not telling us much of a story because worship of aviation has taken over. If that's not a question, I'm sorry.
That's fine. We miss John Coates. He retired happily. He still worked very closely with Wandsworth and Richmond to comment on some of the documents that were produced by the CAA.
I was wondering if it would be a help if they hurried up the renovations on the Hammersmith Bridge, which causes the problems of back-to-back done. I live very near Mortlake High Street, and even though they can't change turn off their engines, and they're all the confusion of going past the brewery with the traffic is terrible. Is there any hope?
Yep, I'm going to let Carol answer that one.
If only they could work out the finance. The finance, I think, goes through the roof. It's over 100 million now. And what proportion Hammersmith and Fulham pay, what proportion the GLA pay, and what proportion the government pay is all to be determined. But there is no, I mean, I've had about 4 different planning applications through now, 4 different scenarios, ferries across the water, all sorts of things to try and alleviate it. But we would all love a solution to Hammersmith Bridge because it would really help the road congestion. So, but it's all amongst the politicians, not us officers, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and we can see the impact of that on our road transport pollution measurements. Are actually quite clear, the impact of that. But it's a big issue. I think somebody said it was about 100 million plus to repair the bridge, and it's who's going to do that and take responsibility.
I have a question regarding domestic heating. Is there anything on the horizon to replace the gas that we currently have?
From the national government, not imminently. So obviously at a local level, it's widely recognised that it's a major part of the problem. I think in your slides earlier, Roger, you had we have slightly updated figures, but it's very similar. So the quicker we're stuck in a difficult position at the moment in that the cost of electricity is very high. And of course, if the government is not going to be phasing out the purchase of new boilers anytime soon, we're in no rush to do it ourselves. So I wish I could tell you there was a better answer.
What about hydrogen?
So I'm no expert on hydrogen. I think in terms of whether the gas supplies are turned off or not, I think that's 10 years away. But for now, the switch to electricity, I think, as Roger said, insulation and LED, there are lots of things that we can be doing. There's a lot around behaviours, just around particularly in big buildings and domestic buildings, around temperature control of our boilers, draft exclusion, and a huge proportion of our heat is lost through our walls. The gentleman earlier talked about wall insulation. There's draft, the loss of, I think it's 10% of our heat is lost through doors and windows. So there's a lot that can be done and reduce our use of gas, but until gas is switched off, and electricity prices also are prohibiting people from switching to electric boilers as well. Anyone else like to say anything?
I might just contribute slightly on it. I'm confess to not being an expert on hydrogen, but Clean Cities campaign, which is my current job, we're part of an organisation called Transport and Environment, which is like a really great, properly academic, Brussels-based think tank on how to decarbonise transport. So, and I'm talking really from the perspective of sustainable aviation fuel here and how they produce it, but I understand it's the same problem with hydrogen. Is in order to make green hydrogen, there's a difference between blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. You need to have renewable energy production. So I don't know what the figures are for hydrogen, but I know it's prohibitively high. And I do know the figures for sustainable aviation fuel because I wrote a book about the Heathrow Airport expansion, which touched on sustainable aviation fuel. For them to be able to replace the amount of fuel which is currently burnt in planes across all of Europe, they would need 13 times the current amount of renewable electricity available in Europe just for aviation fuel. So that's how far they have to go to be able to just meet the current requirement. And it's the same. It's not. I mean, I don't know what the figures are for hydrogen in domestic heating, but it is a similar scale of magnitude. The amount of extra wind turbines and solar that needs to be put in, or there's also e-kerosene, which is done. I'm sure you can tell me about the chemistry of it. I don't understand the chemistry of it, but it's using electrolysis. But that's, again, none of this is available at scale and the speed that we need it.
I was going to make a similar comment.
From an individual perspective, you do have choices. When it comes to heating your home, you can insulate, which will help improve emissions. There are ground source and air source heat pumps available, but you need a very well insulated property for them to work. Hydrogen, it's a new form of fuel that looking at mainly around construction and about these large diesel engines and replacing them with hydrogen. So there's a conversation going on about that at the moment. And of course you can go to electric boilers, but electricity is expensive and it depends how you source it.
I will just add one brief comment actually about the chemistry. At the moment, the way we have to produce hydrogen is by electrolysis, and we must use electricity to carry out that electrolysis. And when we do that, then actually we lose some energy. It's not a 100% efficient process. You start out with 100% of the electricity, you end up actually with by making the hydrogen, maybe losing 20 or 30% in efficiency in doing that. So it's just not really an economically feasible problem at the moment.
Could I just turn to the question of flood risk and a longer term perspective on it, and perhaps this is mainly addressed to the professor. If one looks ahead further, say to projections into a century or so time, or further, is there any scenario under which Kew will not be flooded?
That's a good question.
That's an excellent question. I think probably there isn't any scenario. And, you know, the flood map I showed you, the computer modelling one, was based on very conservative assumptions. And, you know, we already know from other predictions that we're likely to exceed the 2 degrees by 2100. People have looked further ahead, 2200, 2300, and then they're forecasting heights in the rise of the ocean, you know, which instead of being measured in feet are now meters. And, if you look really far ahead, if the whole of the Antarctic ice cap melted, for instance, even I think the Ross Ice Shelf is the same size as France in area and several hundred meters deep. Even that has the capacity to raise the ocean level by several meters. And I think that's going to be probably almost impossible to contend with in hundreds of years ahead from now.
I think we've just got time for one more question, formal question, and then we hope you'll all join us for a drink outside, and all cheer up. And I think all the speakers will be here and happy to be approached for conversation and questions. But one last one.
It's just a quick point of information, really, is that at the moment, yes, making hydrogen by electrolysis is the way to do it. But there is no way that the infrastructure can actually produce enough hydrogen to replace the natural gas. And in fact, the way that the big oil companies want to do it is to crack methane. And that will keep them in business very nicely, thank you. So don't come under any illusions about hydrogen. It's not going to replace things.
I think this is all very depressing.
I don't think we intended it to be depressing, but yeah.
The good news is that the measurements in Richmond are considerably better than they were a few years ago. That's true, and there's obviously been a huge amount of really, really good work done. Anyway, do join us for a drink, and thank you very, very much for coming.